Whatever your particular personal political perspective, or your perceptions of the pros and cons of comedian Richard Herring's polite trolling of people who ask the question, when is International Men's Day on International Women's Day, I'm sure you'll agree there is an element of irony involved, at least at some stage along the way. After all, this is a joke with a jig that is aimed at men on Twitter who apparently voice their overt and unambiguous objection to a day about equality for women by slightly more ambiguously asking about the existence of a day about equality for men. A joke that is repeatedly told by a man on behalf of women on a day about equality for them, who himself overtly and unambiguously objects to a day about equality for men, and who spent half a decade obsessively repeating his joke with a very obvious jig before someone suggested he could raise some money for women on the day about equality for them, while he continues to make it more than a bit about himself. And ironically enough, that someone else was a man. And ironically, Richard only started telling his now famous feminist-friendly finger-wagging joke after he got told off by feminists on the internet himself. Ironically, for declaring that he hates the day about equality for women and then digging himself into a rape-shaped hole. Which means that one certain irony about Richard Herring's joke with a jig is that every year he spends an entire day about equality for women, obsessively admonishing a possibly imaginary reflection of his former and present self. Interestingly, one inevitable irony about Richard Herring's joke with a jig, which has admittedly been a very long time in coming, finally came to pass in November 2018. Because after over half a decade of telling anyone who would listen that nobody wants a day about equality for men because it's stupid and unnecessary, last November Richard Herring joined some of his peers on a podcast for the specific purpose of celebrating a day about equality for men. Ironically, this landmark moment actually occurred a day late because the organisers couldn't get the venue on their ideal date, because it had already been booked for an entirely non-day about equality related podcast the day before, which ironically was hosted by none other than Richard Herring, which ironically even made some headlines after a man who appeared on it opened up about his horrific experience of childhood sexual abuse. Anyway, for the uninitiated, Standard Issue describes itself as a magazine-style podcast for women about women, which is co-hosted and co-created by 4 women, including comedian Sarah Milligan. Once a year in November, they turn their spotlight onto men, and I'm pleased to report that they do it in a relatively non-judgmental, inclusive and positive way. I do have some criticisms about their podcast on toxic masculinity, but that's a story for another day. But in all fairness, I did find their International Men's Day special to be a refreshingly positive and interesting affair. Indeed, one of the most ironic things about Richard's belated contribution to a day all about equality for men was how much he often managed to stand out from the crowd, and not in a good way. Here's his opening remarks.
It's a bit of a millstone around my neck in that I know the date of it very well, and you know, and you get from both sides. You know, when I do this on International Women's Day, I get most people love it and most people get it, and most feminists, I have to say, really get it and love it and understand a man doing this is quite apt because it sort of corrals that section off and everyone else can get on with enjoying International Women's Day. But some feminists go, well, why is he making it about all about a man, which is sort of the point I'm making about the other guys as well, I suppose, and some extreme male Menonists, I suppose you would call them, get upset with me for not supporting the Brotherhood, but it just feels a bit too much. You know, there's perfectly good mental health days and suicide prevention days, and I think there's an element where guys are trying to say, oh no, but International Men's Day is about this, but it's still 50% about, why haven't we got a day? I want a day. Why is it not my birthday today? What's going on? Why has he got a birthday and I haven't? Why is there a National AIDS Day? I haven't got AIDS. When will there be a day for people who don't have AIDS? When's that going to happen? So that's my problem with it, because I think it should, So in a way, I'm sort of coming around to thinking I'd quite like to make International Men's Day a proper thing where we can celebrate being men without it being as a response to the idea that it's ridiculous. When's National Slave Owners Month?
That was last week.
This has taken a turn.
So yeah, I do have quite a lot of feelings about it, but it would be. But I'm also proud to be a man, and I think we should celebrate men. And by no means do I think all men have cushy, perfect lives, and there's lots of things that are very awful. And
I'm not proud to be a man. I don't think I deserve any credit for it.
No,
it's literally just something that happened to me, and I feel neither pride nor shame.
That's good. Well, that's maybe what we should be aiming for eventually.
Yes, it's
in all these days. There's too many days that I'm trying to make people proud of what they are, and maybe just everyone should be a little bit ashamed.
And yes, for anyone who can't quite believe they just heard it, let me confirm that yes, ironic as it so obviously is, that was Richard Herring, entirely unironically, declaring that he'd quite like to make International Men's Day a proper thing, where we can celebrate being men without it being seen as a response to the idea that it's ridiculous, and the equivalent of National Slave Owners Month. Although, unlike a lot of people who've been doing exactly that for a whole lot of years, not enough to actually do it anytime soon. By contrast, the other three guests had predictably never heard of International Men's Day, but neither were David Mitchell, Colin Jackson or David Morrissey dismissive of the concept, and over a relatively light-hearted hour-long discussion, offered a series of insightful and often quite personal contributions that helped to dispel some of the toxic stereotypes about the less fairer sex, and helped to highlight how different and complex and funny and brilliant real men can very often be. From Colin Jackson's obsession with shoes to David Mitchell's inability to drive a car, and best of all, David Morrissey's brilliant and intimate revelations about a poster of a man called Ben Murphy that hung for some time on his childhood wall. Personally, I think it's well worth a listen, and I'll leave a link. Two things I think that were particularly telling were the juxtaposition between two very different answers to the proposition that it might be possible for men to have it all, and the responses that followed the following question, which was the only one that was unhelpfully accompanied by an extremely odd, not to mention loaded supposition.
Were you encouraged to show your emotions when you were younger? Because it's quite often put out there that men aren't brought up to feel any emotion other than anger. So I wondered if you were encouraged to kind of just go with it.
Again, David Morrissey's response particularly stood out, and included an observation about the impact of something he called toxic shame, and the fact that in this life you're guilty about what you've done, but you're ashamed for who you are. I don't want to be unduly unfair to Richard, because he did contribute some personal insights of his own, but for a man who now fundraises for a charity that helps victims of domestic abuse, some of his attempts at confessional humour just felt cringeworthy and more than a little poorly judged. For example, recollections about the guests' childhood bedrooms included an anecdote from Richard about an early attempt at being a peeping Tom, and attempting to dig a peephole into his sister's bedroom. And here's an excerpt where you can almost hear one of the co-presenters wince.
I'd like to be tall, which I can't do anything about. You get used to being...
You could wear lifts.
I could wear... Yeah, but that's,
What?
It's not, that isn't really being tall. And then, you'd seduce all the wonderful women if my wife had died. I'm assuming. My wife would be dead. That would be the first, and my wife would have died. Yeah. And I'd have mourned her.
What you'd like to change about yourself is that you'd like to not be married.
Dead. And her death would have caused me so much sorrow that I would have grown a foot.
Right.
Just like some people go grey overnight, some people's just legs grow very long. And then, but if I was wearing lifts, and if I was single, I don't want to be tall now. What's the point in that?
Wasted when you're married.
When I was younger, it would have been useful, wouldn't it? Reach high shelves.
Porn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now I've seen a lady's boobs, I don't need to reach the porn. Thanks
Seen
to my
some
wife.
boobs, you've
Thanks
seen
to my
them all.
living wife.
Is that what you call her? Your living wife?
My currently living wife. I'm not planning to murder her. Don't imagine if this gets used in court.
Yeah,
We
would hand it
seemed
in.
Richard Herring was planning something here. He covered it quite well, and did say he wasn't going to murder us.
The
defence rests its case.
the entire audience just shouts stranger danger.
Then, I'm Jimmy Savile,
And I'm Jimmy Savile.
and we're running the London Marathon.
I hope nobody dies.
If they do, Bagsy, I take them to the mortuary.
How's about that then, guys and girls?
Of course, the entirely predictable and inevitable news that Richard Herring has finally jumped on board the International Men's Day bandwagon isn't the ultimate irony of his disingenuous joke. The ultimate irony is how clearly it exposes the callous, condescending and deeply chauvinistic nature of those who get the jag in Richard Herring's joke and yet laugh along anyway. Because, like Richard, they're the ones so clearly threatened by the notion of a day about equality. They're the ones who are furious about its very existence. And like Richard, they're the ones that have gone out of their way to undermine it, and undermine it in a deeply cynical, nasty, and frankly coercive, controlling way, by first portraying anyone calling for it as callous, condescending, and deeply chauvinistic, only to then turn around and try and appropriate the day to promote their toxic mantra about toxic masculinity, which is pretty fucking ironic when you really stop to think about it. Of course, the fact that Richard finally celebrated November 19, albeit a day late, wasn't the only significant development to occur in 2018, because while obsessively hunting down people on social media to publicly shame for definitely being furious chauvinistic cheese helmets, last year he also found the time to fundraise for a charity for victims of abuse. And consequently, over the last two International Women's Day, he's managed to raise something close to £250,000, which is all very commendable, I'm sure you'll agree. Although, as he notes in his daily online blog, as great as it was to raise so much money in such a ludicrous fashion, the numbers of people making this same basic remark is going up, not down. And the kinds of people saying it are less bumbling idiots thinking they're making a brilliant point, and more slightly scary incels. Which is, let's face it, a pretty ironic portrait to paint or possibly project on people he's never met. And ironic that the numbers are growing given the patron saint of a day for incels has been now hammering away at this peculiar mission for 7 whole years. He continues, "What I am doing is, of course, a little rude, but as far as I saw, none of the people I informed got angry with me. Barely any of them respond, and a lot of them delete their tweets when they realise their attempt at witty political comment was just a bit dim. But there are nasty elements buzzing around when I do this, and not just from meninists, who refuse to accept that the world isn't skewed against them. It always pisses off some feminists as well. The day leaves me fragile, and the criticisms and rebukes and veiled threats do get to you. Maybe one day someone will take a pop at me over this deliberate attempt to annoy, but I suppose it's still worth it for the number of people who find it amusing and the positive spin of it now raising money." Weirdly, the only comment that upset me was from a feminist who referenced my wife in a patronising and weirdly sexist way, but I suspect that she'd just seen me as a lightning rod for some other issues in her life, and the tweet was quickly deleted. But the response is overwhelmingly positive, and the results are so spectacular that it's amazing to think that anyone could be snide about it. Well over £250,000 to a charity for 2 days' work. If it breaks me or gets me killed, I'm still glad I started this. I will never be allowed to finish. £250,000 to charity for 2 days' work is unquestionably a commendable feat. Although in fairness, all sorts of people can raise all sorts of money for charity for all sorts of reasons, and I don't think it's necessarily uncharitable to comment on the exact nature of Richard Herring's work, or for that matter the quality of his workmanship, because despite his charitable pledge to provide a much needed public service once again this year, Richard somehow managed to overlook at least one stakeholder's question on the day. And in the next episode, I'll outline the ironic reasons as to why that may very well have been. A reason which gets to the very heart of why so many feminists feel so threatened by the very notion of a day for men, and ironically involves a seldom told story about the charity that now actively encourages and promotes Richard Herring's now biannual work. Oh, and in a relative exclusive for the Glass Blind Spots, I'll also reveal what Richard will be up to this November 19.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.